Welcome back. In today's lecture, we're going to look at the interaction between the first European settlers um, from Spain, Portugal, and then later Britain, France, and the Netherlands, their interaction with the Native American people, also called the Indigenous people, or simply the Indians, which is a misnomer, of course, because these Indians are not from South Asia, but that was the name that was given by Christopher Columbus and the early Spaniards. And many people, including Native Americans in the United States today, often refer to themselves as Indians. The next slide you can see what's generally acknowledged to be the origins of the people in the Western Hemisphere, crossing from Siberia into what is now Alaska, across the Bering Strait at times when the sea levels declined or the Bering Strait was frozen and they were able to simply walk across. And as you can see in the next slide, they very quickly populated the entire region of the Western Hemisphere. I might note that recent excavations on the west coast of South America have shown that some people arrived before this migration across Siberia, and it's believed that they arrived on rafts from the Western Pacific Islands. Turning to Europe, Africa, and Asia, at the time of the European colonization or conquest of Western Hemisphere, and for many hundreds of years before, all three continents were in close contact with each other, largely through the extensive trade routes. And here you can see European trade routes with Asia and with Africa, even though the northern part of Africa has a large desert, the Saharan Desert. Camel trains were able to traverse that area. And at this time, the Europeans did not know of the existence of the Western Hemisphere because it had not been mentioned in the Bible, nor had the Romans and the Greeks, who were the font of all knowledge at the time of the Renaissance, had no knowledge of the Western Hemisphere. And as we'll see in a few minutes, the realization that a large hemisphere existed between Europe and Asia by sailing westward had a profound intellectual impact on the Europeans. Turning to Africa, it had long maintained contact with Europe and Asia, and we can see in the next slide some of the major trading routes and cultures in Africa. And you will notice in Central Africa, the Bantu culture had large linguistic spread, and it spread through Central and Southern Africa. Here we see an ornament made of a camel, made with precious stones, just showing the importance of the camel for the Africans to maintain contact with Europe and Asia. Returning to the Western Hemisphere, what we'll see in this brief overview of the indigenous peoples before conquest is a wide variation in the cultures, and that's largely determined by the environment. And we'll focus in a few minutes on the Aztecs in Central America. On this slide, we see a Spanish drawing of Indians in the Pacific West part of the United States, and this is the Oregon, Washington area, very fertile agricultural land. You can see the bounty of the crops there, apples and other fruits and vegetables, as well as seafood. And this was dictated by the climate, which was ideal for agriculture, as well as the bountiful harvest from the seas. Turning to the next slide, here we see the great range of cultures among the indigenous people in North America. From the north, you can see in the Arctic region, then the subarctic, moving down through the Great Plains, the southeast, of course, where we are in Texas, you have just north here, the Caddo Indian Nation, and then down through Mexico and Mesoamerica. And we'll look briefly at the Aztecs because it had a great influence on a later colonization of North America. Of course, you do not need to know all the names of the various Indian cultures or tribes here, and these, I will note, are just a few of the many, many hundreds of different Indian societies and linguistic groups that existed on the eve of European conquest. Now here we see just an example from the southwestern region of the United States. This is from New Mexico, so-called cliff dwellings built by the Pueblo Indians. And as you can see, they're built with the local material, which was adobe made from mud and straw, and that's dried in the sun. These particular dwellings, which you can go visit today, were built under a cliff overhang, providing protection to the people from the sun and the rain. Here in Texas, in far west Texas, near El Paso, about a 10-hour drive from here, you can go see remnants of historic people at the Hueco Tanks State Park. The area there is quite flat, very, very arid. It's a desert. And this is the state park here. These are the so-called Hueco Tanks. Those of you who speak Spanish will know the word Hueco means hole or basin, because they're natural depressions in these rocks that collect the little rainfall that falls in the desert. And animals, as well as prehistoric people, would visit there. And of course, the people would kill the animals who went there for water. When I went there a couple years ago, the first thing I noticed everywhere were signs warning of the snakes. And there were a lot of rattlesnakes. I saw probably 20 or 30 in a 2-hour visit. To reach the cave drawings, you have to get on your back and slide under this rock. And there's a small cave, and using the special flashlight provided by the park ranger to protect the drawings, you're allowed to take photographs. And on the next slide, we see an animal figure. These are several thousand years old. And the next slide has another animal figure. Turning now to the migration of Europeans and Africans to Western Hemisphere. First, we saw the Portuguese taking slaves from Africa. They would trade with Africans for the slaves and transporting them through the Middle East region, and some went to southern Asia. Now, Columbus, of course, arrived in the West Indies and the Caribbean in 1492, and this presented what's often called a challenge of mutual discovery. It was a challenge for the Europeans to deal with the indigenous people after they realized they weren't Asians, and then the Native Americans had a totally different view of the Europeans. First, let's look at the European response. The Europeans, as I mentioned before, did not know of the existence of the Western Hemisphere. And once they determined that they weren't in Asia, then they had to realize that this was an entirely new landmass populated that had not been mentioned either in the Bible or by the classical Greeks and Romans. Based on their experience in Africa, particularly the Portuguese experience trading slaves, they had a very racist response, and they regarded all of the natives as savages, somewhat akin to the Africans. Furthermore, the Europeans weren't sure if the natives had souls, and so, if they could baptize them as Catholics. So, in fact, Columbus sent back a number of Indians after first arriving to Spain, where they were taught to read and write Spanish, and then they were taught basic Christian theology. and a bishop in Spain then interviewed them and determined that yes, they were rational because they'd been able to learn Spanish, and also they had been able to learn the basic tenets of Christianity. And at that point, the Spanish decided to send many thousands of missionaries there. Now, turning to the Native Americans, their response was quite different. For the Indians, the Europeans were at first regarded as simply another Indian society, which they had much experience dealing with. And in fact, the Indian experience was when they encountered new groups of Indians, new tribes, new societies, they welcomed them as equals. And particularly in the case of the Spaniards, when the Indians saw their large vessels, saw their horses, saw their armor, their cannons, all the incredible devices, they thought they would very much welcome them to trade. They would welcome them as allies in their constant warfare with neighboring tribes. And they also would like to use what they thought was their magic, their shamans, their healers, for the new diseases that were playing havoc with the Indians. In a few minutes, we'll discuss the Columbian Exchange, but an important element of that involved the diseases that were carried by many of the Europeans and African slaves. These were diseases which had never been experienced in the Western Hemisphere, and as a result, none of the Indians had acquired any partial immunities as the Europeans and Africans have, and these diseases devastated the Indian populations, depending on the location, killing as many as 90 or 95%. Let's look briefly at Columbus Day, which is celebrated in the United States every year on October 10th. In 1892 was the 400th anniversary of the arrival of Christopher Columbus. And at that time, in that context, both in the United States and all through the Western Hemisphere, October 10th, 1892 was a celebration of discovery. Discovery of what? Discovery by the superior European civilization of the Western Hemisphere with what was then perceived as primitive people. However, by 1992, 100 years later, which is the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival, there was a much different interpretation of this historical event. People asked, should it be a discovery? Well, not really, because thank you very much, the Indians didn't need discovering. They had their own complex societies and webs, and moreover, thanks to the Spanish, many of them had almost been wiped out. Was it an encounter? What are they going to call this major celebration? Encounter is a neutral term. Or was it a collision or invasion? Now, of course, the title of this lecture is Collision of Cultures, and that's what I think it really is. It was a collision. It was not a neutral. Or was it an invasion? It was probably both of those. Next slide. Now, October 10th is celebrated in the state of South Dakota as Native American Day. As you probably know, South Dakota has many, many Native Americans. Los Angeles, California officially calls it Indigenous Peoples Day, and recently the entire state of California has renamed it Indigenous People Day. In Latin America, it's referred to, and long has been referred to, as Dia de la Raza. This is to celebrate the diverse roots of the Hispanic culture, where La Raza refers to the commingling of the indigenous and the Spanish or Portuguese people. Now, why is this a federal holiday? Well, first, Columbus Day was only an Italian-American holiday in the United States. Columbus, you'll recall, was Italian, although the Spanish king and queen paid for his ships and crew and the exploration costs. But Many Italian Americans were proud of him, and particularly after many Italian Americans started arriving in the United States in the late 1800s, they celebrated Columbus Day, proud of the Italian American. However, when the Ku Klux Klan was started again in the 1920s, and you'll study this in the next course, it strongly opposed Catholicism. Indeed, Catholic schools were closed down in many states. And it also strongly opposed immigrants from Southern Europe, part of their nativism. Southern Europe, primarily against the Italians, and the Italians were not only from Southern Europe, they were Catholic. So, and also in 1928, you'll learn this in the next course, the Democratic candidate to be U.S. president was Al Smith, who was a Catholic, and at that time there were many, many campaign advertisements by his opponents saying that Americans should not vote for Al Smith because he was a Catholic, and being a Catholic, the argument went, his loyalty was not to the United States, but to the Pope in Rome. So, in 1937, the Catholics and Italian Americans met with President Roosevelt and said the president should celebrate a Catholic with a national holiday, and this would be a sign that the discrimination of Catholics by the Protestant majority was over, and a national holiday would celebrate a Catholic. And sure enough, President Roosevelt and Congress declared October 10th Columbus Day. Be sure to read the section in your textbook on the Columbian Exchange. One of the 5 short answer questions on the exam will be to identify the major elements of the Columbian Exchange, and the 4 of them are listed here, and to give a few examples of each one. Okay, so Columbian Exchange, which you may well have studied previously, involves the exchange not just by Christopher Columbus and his ship, but in general by Europeans and Africans moving to the Western Hemisphere, and some products and diseases that move from the Western Hemisphere to Europe and Africa. First and foremost are diseases. As I mentioned before, the Europeans, as well as the African slaves they brought, sometimes were sick and were carrying diseases, deadly diseases such as smallpox, various strains of the flu. And when they arrived in the Western Hemisphere, some of the Europeans and Africans died of these diseases, but relatively few compared to the native Indian populations, which had never been exposed to these. And in biology, this is called acquired immunity, because the Europeans and many of the Africans had grown up and as children or adolescents been exposed to smallpox and the influenza virus and others, and acquired some immunity. Some of them died, but others survived and acquired immunity. So next time they were exposed, they did not die. But however, totally virgin territory in the Western Hemisphere, and these diseases decimated the Indian population. And the word decimated is the only correct word, because in most places, around 90 or 95% of the Indians died within months of the arrival of the Europeans. Indeed, the diseases traveled faster than the Europeans physically did. For instance, in South America, when Pizarro and the Spaniards arrived and they started marching towards the Inca Empire on the west coast of South America, it took them a while to get there, but their diseases spread faster, and by the time they reached the Inca Empire, 80 to 90% of the warriors were dead or very seriously ill. The one significant disease that is believed to have originated in the Western Hemisphere and moved eastward to Europe and Africa and Asia was syphilis. um, but syphilis, while many people suffered and did die, some people died in Europe, it was nothing like smallpox and the other diseases. Second major category is plants. Again, the textbook has some specific examples. Traveling from Europe, excuse me, you have wheat, which was grown by a lot of Indians over the years, but much of the exchange went the other way, and particularly important in this regard was corn or maize, which first originated in southern Mexico, spread throughout the Western Hemisphere, and then it was quickly introduced into Europe and very quickly fed many, many people in Europe. And in fact, with the introduction of corn, mass starvation virtually ended in Western Europe because corn is relatively easy to grow. It will grow on poor soil, and it provides a high number of calories per acre planted. The third major category are animals, and here the main exchange involved European animals such as horses, and pigs came over from Europe. Of course, the turkey originated in the Western Hemisphere and was taken back, but never became a major source of food in Europe. And then the fourth category is people. You'll notice in the textbook they only list 3 elements of the Columbian Exchange: diseases, plants, and animals. But many other people, including myself, believe people should be in this category. Now, moving from the Western Hemisphere eastward, a few Native Americans were taken back to Europe almost as curiosities, but you did not have significant migration from the Western Hemisphere to Europe. But of course, the other way around, you had many, many millions of slaves, which we'll look at in a minute, brought over from, forcibly brought from Africa throughout the Western Hemisphere. And indeed, the vast majority of African slaves went to Brazil or the Caribbean, and relatively few went to what is now the United States. And then you had the Europeans themselves, the Spanish, the Portuguese, others who came over, and they had sexual relations with Indian women, either consensual or forcibly, and you had their offspring. Then this slide you can see, this is just an early drawing of slave traders in Africa taking slaves from the interior towards the coast to be traded. You will note that the slaves or the Africans who became slaves were apprehended and marched not by Europeans, not by white Europeans, but by other Africans or Islamic slave traders. But many of the wealthiest families in Africa at this time were involved in organizing the roundup of slaves and then selling them in the port cities to the Western slave traders. The next map will show the Atlantic slave trade. As you can see, the slaves destined for the Western Hemisphere came from Western Africa, those areas indicated in blue on the map. And while around 100,000 went to Europe, that may surprise you, they didn't go there to work on plantations. A few worked on the docks, but most of them went to be personal servants of wealthy families who liked to show off their black African slaves. And you can see that the vast majority of the slaves, almost 5 million, went to the West Indies, the Caribbean, 4 million went to Brazil, and relatively few, 360,000 estimated, went to the British colonies in what is now the United States. And in fact, we'll see later as we study slavery in great detail, most of the slaves who went to the British colonies first went to the Caribbean for 6 months or a year, and then they moved up. They were not moved up, they were forced up to the colonies. One takeaway from this that many students hadn't realized is fewer than 10% of the Africans who were forcibly brought to the Western Hemisphere as slaves, fewer than 10% actually went to what is now the United States. White slavery today, what is it? Well, on the positive side, traditional slavery was last legally outlawed in 1985. Yes, 1985 in the West African country of Equatorial Guinea, where some wealthy families were buying and selling other black Africans. But since then, there is no legal system for slavery. White slavery refers, of course, to the human trafficking, forcible human trafficking, largely, but not entirely, of young women for sexual purposes. And you may know that Houston is one of the centers for such human trafficking, with women who are trafficked across the border from Mexico, some from China and Central America, and they're trafficked to Houston, and then from Houston all over the US. And there's a similar trade moving to Europe and Asia from elsewhere. Now, it's very important to understand that the Spanish experience we're going to talk about here for a few minutes in both Mexico and South America created great expectations for the English colonists, who almost 100 years later arrived in what's now the United States in Jamestown, Virginia, and then later in Massachusetts. So the Spanish first colonized Latin America from Mexico down south, along with the Portuguese, almost 100 years before the English got into the game. And we'll talk more about that later. This is the map which you've probably seen previously. This is what's called Mesoamerica. It's southern Mexico and part of Central America. And this shows the Aztec Empire in 1519, when the Spanish soldier conquistador Hernan Cortez first landed in central Mexico, up near Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico coast. What you can see in this map in green is the Maya civilization. Now, the Maya civilization had reached its peak about 700 years before the Spanish arrived, and then most think because of environmental degradation, the Mayan civilization rather, had, while not disappeared, greatly decreased. The large Mayan cities such as Palenque and Tikal in Copan and the southern part of the green area there were depopulated, and the population went down significantly, and the people went off into small farms. So when the Spanish arrived, there were relatively few Mayas. They were in the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula. You can see that up there, Tulum, Chichen Itza. Up in that general area are the famous ocean resort towns of Cozumel and Cancun, just a couple hours from Houston on a flight. And we're going to focus our attention to the left or to the west in central Mexico, which is where the Aztec Empire was at its peak in 1519. Again, that was the year Hernan Cortez arrived. So let's look briefly at the Aztecs, and then we'll look at the Spanish experience. So the Aztecs were a group of Mexican Indians or native people living in northern Mexico, but they weren't settled. They were roaming around Mexico, looking for a place to build their civilization. And according to Aztec legend, they had to keep traveling until they found what you see on this slide, until they found an eagle standing on or perched on a cactus eating a snake. So they traveled and wandered all across northern Mexico and moved down to central Mexico. When, about 150 years before the Spanish arrived, they, according to legend, found such an eagle perched on a cactus eating a snake, and the Aztecs decided to build their city there, and that's where, of course, they built their capital. The next slide. This is the current flag of Mexico. And you can see in the flag, many of you who may never have noticed this before, what is in the middle there? Well, you have an eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in the mouth. And that is on the national flag of Mexico. The area, unfortunately, where the Aztecs found this eagle with the snake in its mouth was in a small marshy area. So what the Aztecs did is they built small islands, scooping up the mud from the lake and putting it on the island, and they built walls around to keep the mud there. And that's where they farmed, and that's where they built their temples and where they lived. This farmland was very, very productive because the water from the lake, the mud from the lake bed, is very, very fertile because it has decayed vegetable matter. When the fish die, their bones and whatnot are in the mud, making it very fertile. On the next slide, here we see a Spanish drawing of the Aztec capital right near modern-day Mexico City. It was called by the Aztecs Tenochtitlan. When the Spanish arrived, the leaders described it as the most beautiful city they'd ever seen. They said it was larger than any city in Europe, and it was more elegant. So as you can see, it's built in the middle of a shallow lake, a very marshy area. In the center, you can see the ceremonial pyramids. And of course, part of the Aztec religious practice involved every day cutting the heart, the beating heart out of a living person. And the priests would hold that up and offer it to the gods so that the sun would come up the next day. That's in the center. The other area you can see where people live, and much of this is agricultural. And the little lines running through there are canals, much like Venice. On the next slide, you can travel down those little canals today. And this is one of the boats. I've been there several times. I've never seen that many tourists. They tend to be Mexicans going out and having a lunch, and you can have a mariachi musical band playing there, and you go down, and what you're actually seeing are the actual islands that were built by the Aztecs for agriculture. So, as I mentioned, part of the Aztec culture or religion demanded the sacrifice of hearts torn out of living people. And like all indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere, the Aztecs were also involved with warfare with neighbors. The Aztecs were particularly advanced in their warfare, and they conquered many nearby tribes or societies. And they didn't kill the people, they required them to send tribute, corn or whatever, to them every year. And they also, when they attacked their enemies, they often used wooden swords because they didn't want to kill some of the enemy soldiers. They wanted to bring them back alive as prisoners so their hearts could be sacrificed. And we're talking about many, many thousands of people sacrificed a year. And in fact, on the Aztec leader's birthday, it said 5,000 people, that's right, 5,000 people in one day in Mexico City were taken to the top of the pyramid, held down by the priests, and their hearts were cut out. Here we just have a Spanish drawing showing, from the Spanish viewpoint, the great superiority of the Spanish weapons. We have crossbows, we have armor, we have early weapons, and there we have the indigenous people barefoot and, clearly didn't have the advanced weaponry. It's important, though, to realize how the Spanish were able to conquer the Aztecs. It wasn't just because of their superior weapons. It was because of the alliances they had with the many Indian tribes that had been subjugated by the Mayas. As I mentioned, a key element in the Spanish ability to defeat the Aztecs was forming alliances with hundreds of thousands of Indians whose societies or tribes had been subjugated by the Aztecs. And an Indian woman by the name known as La Malinche played a key role in this. Be sure you know who La Malinche is for the exam. Just know that she was the Indian woman who helped Cortez in his conquest of the Aztecs. Now, La Malinche was born and raised, so she learned both the Maya language and the language of the Aztecs. And in the village where she grew up, several years before Cortez arrived in Mexico, a group of Spaniards were shipwrecked and taken in by the villagers, and who offered them assistance and saved their lives. Well, La Malinche was a little girl, and she learned Spanish from these sailors. In fact, she spoke Spanish quite well. By coincidence, when the Aztec ruler heard that the Spanish had arrived and he sent gifts, he also sent a number of women to be companions of the Spanish men. And one of those women happened to be La Malinche. And of course, the Spaniards were quite surprised to hear her speaking Spanish. Cortez decided to use her as his intermediary to visit the tribes that had been subjugated by the Aztecs to seek their assistance in overthrowing the Aztecs. And Malinche played a vital role in doing this. On the next slide, here we see a Spanish drawing with La Malinche on the right, and with Cortez when the Spaniards went out to meet with various Indian groups. On the next slide, this is a Spanish drawing of Cortez with Malinche at his side, meeting with Moctezuma, the Aztec ruler. Now the question is, how do we depict Malinche? The next slide. Is she a hero? For many centuries, until fairly recently, many people in Latin America viewed her as a hero. Why? And this is a depiction from the 1940s or 50s with La Malinche, who looks like a movie star, with Cortez. And she was viewed then as, well, someone who helped the civilized Europeans, the Spanish, the Christians, the Catholics defeat the barbarian Indians. And these people who would say this would say, thanks to Malinche and people like her, Latin Americans, the majority of Latin Americans speak Spanish and are Catholic. Look at the next slide. Here we have a Mexican banknote from about 100 years ago. This is from the Tabasco area in northern Mexico. And the Indian woman there is Malinche. More recently, however, and this goes back to what we were talking about in the introductory lecture about interpretation of history. Now she's viewed by many as a traitor to the Latin American people, to the indigenous people. This is a book in Portuguese that views La Malinche as a traitor to the people, the indigenous people of Latin America. And well, she certainly helped the Spanish conquer. There's no question of that. The next slide, Malinchista is a fairly common phrase used in Mexico. And what it means is not so much a traitor. I think it usually means someone who prefers foreign things to Mexican things. For instance, when I lived in Mexico, I remember some Mexican friends went to Miami and they came back, and one woman was showing off her designer sunglasses that cost her several $100s, and her friends joked and said, "Oh, you're a Malinchista," like, and her friend said, "Yeah, where did you get them? We want to get them too, ha ha." But here we have on this slide a a person saying, "Ha ha ha, you call me Malinchista because I prefer pop music in English." Oops. Okay. Sorry. Now, as a result of the conquest of Latin America, particularly Mexico and Peru, Bolivia, Spain became the wealthiest country in the world. There were huge silver deposits. They used the Indians in large silver mines. And there also were gold deposits, but silver was real key to wealth. The Spanish set up the encomienda system, which was, they had a huge area of land that Spain controlled. The king and queen said it's ours. And so they gave big, big parcels of land to supporters. On the only condition was that the people who were given this land under the encomienda system were required to teach basic Spanish to the Indians and to convert them to the Catholic religion and provide religious instruction. They were told to take good care of the Indians in terms of food and shelter. And in return, they were allowed to use the Indians on the Spanish agricultural land for a certain number of months a year. It was not slavery per se because the Indians weren't, bought and sold, but they were very much under the thumb and control of the Spaniards. So Spaniards dominated the Western Hemisphere until 1588, when the Spanish Navy was defeated in a major battle by the English, and this battle occurred in Europe, and the English were greatly aided by very rough seas, almost a hurricane, which just in and of itself destroyed much of the Spanish fleet. Because by 1588, almost 100 years after Columbus had arrived, the English had not set up any permanent colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And we'll talk in next class more about that. So the Spanish effort was focused in North America, in central Mexico, in the area right above central Mexico with the great silver mines in Zacatecas and Guanajuato area. Now the Spanish did have missions in California, New Mexico, that whole area I showed you on the map, as well as, of course, we know in Texas. And this is a map of the Spanish missions. And on the next slide, we have, of course, the famous one in San Antonio, the Alamo, which many of you have seen, and we'll talk at length about the importance of the Alamo in the Texas War of Independence. But these missions were set up, part of the encomienda system. The church was obviously set up to educate the Indians to be Christians. They also had workshops for the Indians, and they had agricultural land. Now, other European countries also wanted to get into the action in the Western Hemisphere. The Dutch, who were great trading powers, were also searching for a passage to East Asia, and you'll recall that Christopher Columbus went west across the Atlantic, thinking he could quickly reach Asia. And so Henry Hudson sailed in the northern part of North America, arrived in an area around New York City, went up the large river, the Hudson River that flows into New York City, and he could take ocean ships up that river for several hundred miles, and he thought he'd found the long-sought passage to East Asia, but alas, he didn't. The Dutch set up their headquarters in New York City, and they didn't really come over to colonize like the English did later with farms and families. They were either looking for a route across the Western Hemisphere, or they were trading with the Indians to acquire skins from animals, and particularly beaver skins, because beaver hats were very, very popular with the ladies in Europe at that time. We can see here a very fashionable lady in Europe wearing a beaver hat, and the demand was so high for beaver hats that the beavers were almost hunted to extinction until, fortunately for the beavers, the fad changed. On this slide, we see the headquarters of the Dutch colonization effort called New Amsterdam in what is now New York City, and specifically the southern part of Manhattan Island. This is right now the heart of New York City. And you can see the row of houses, and then behind it a wooden wall, and then some more structures. Well, originally, when they first arrived, the Dutch arrived and built some of those small houses in the foreground, and they constructed the wall there, a large wooden wall, to protect themselves from Indians who were not very pleased that the Dutch had arrived, and it was to prevent Indian attacks. That wall that street became known as the street with a wall, or simply Wall Street, and you may have heard of Wall Street, which is exactly in that location today in New York City, which is, of course, the center of the U.S. financial and banking industry. As regards the English, we'll talk about them at length in the next lecture and subsequent lectures. But the English also wanted to move out into the Western Hemisphere, partly because they were running out of new farmland in England. England's not a very large country, and they needed, the population was growing, and they needed more farmland. They also needed wood, primarily for shipbuilding. England was a very important maritime power, a large navy, particularly after having defeated the Spanish Armada. And many of the forests had been cut down. And in addition to shipbuilding, of course, wood at that time was used for virtually everything, building homes, for cooking fires, for construction, for furniture, you name it. And then the English had a traditional rivalry with both the French and, of course, the Spanish, because by this time the Reformation had taken place. The English had left the Catholic Church, and the French and Spanish had remained Catholic, and there was also there's a religious rivalry. And we'll talk about the English expansion in greater detail in the next class. And finally, look in terms of European powers, the French. The French moved into North America largely to, like the Dutch, partly to find a route to East Asia, but then also to trade with the Indians for animal skins, which they could sell at great profit in Europe. Look at the next slide. You can see the strategic importance of the Mississippi River. So in this slide, you can see the British colonies there, the 13 colonies on the eastern coast, and then this huge green area called New France. There was very few French people were there. There were many Indians there, living as they'd always lived. And in fact, as the British moved out into the 13 colonies, they either pushed the Indians out or some of the Indians voluntarily left before they were pushed out. So don't let this fool you and think, oh, that there are tens of thousands of French people living there. There were very few. They were mainly trappers who would meet with the Indians to trade furs. And the thick blue line running north from New Orleans is, of course, the Mississippi River. And this was crucial for the French because the French would buy many animal skins, and then they'd take them down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, where they would be exported to Europe. Throughout this course, we will see the strategic importance of the Mississippi River and the city of New Orleans. Later, we'll see with slavery, the Mississippi River was crucial in transporting cotton from the large cotton plantations down to New Orleans for shipment to Europe and to the northern cities. And the next slide, this is just a contemporary sketch of of downtown Quebec, and this shows sort of the French influence on the architecture. And then this is a drawing at the time of a French activities near New Orleans in Louisiana. And you can see, it was interesting, a small African boy. But here they are trading with the Indians. And very few French people wanted to move there because southern Louisiana is very hot and humid, and there were very many tropical diseases. So the French people who moved to North America tended to move up into the very far up into Canada. And finally, let's look briefly at the impact on the Indians of the Spanish horses. And we'll be looking at the impact, the European impact on the Indians throughout this course. But it's important to realize that the horses arrived with the Spanish. And that was almost 100 years before the first English settlements in Virginia. And as the Spanish moved up through Mexico, and then they moved up into what's now the states of New Mexico and Arizona, that general area, the Indians quickly saw the advantage of having horses. Some of the horses had escaped, just run off, and others, the Indians would raid the Spanish settlements to steal the horses. And they found the horses extremely useful when hunting buffalo, in addition to use in potential conflicts with other tribes. You can move much faster. The next slide, we'll look at some of the Indian hunting techniques. Many of you may have seen a buffalo or bison in real life. They're huge animals. They have horns. They're very powerful. It was very difficult for the Indians to go out with their bows and arrows walking and shoot the buffalo. They did, but if the buffalo panicked, stampeded, and the Indians were in their way, they'd just be killed. But the Indians found that the horses were absolutely fantastic in forcing the buffalo into groups where they could easily kill them. And one favorite technique on the Great Plains, where there are natural cliffs, you can see in this drawing, drop off of 10, 20, 30 feet. The Great Plains is not absolutely flat everywhere. In most places it is, but there are small cliffs. So what the Indians would do, and they used to do this before they had horses, and they could do it even better with horses, is they'd wait till the wind was blowing across and down towards the cliff. So they would go several miles away behind a huge herd of buffalo and light the dry grass on fire. The fire, thanks to the wind, would spread towards the cliff, and the smoke would spread into the buffalo, who would panic and run against the cliff. And here we see a drawing of what happens. The buffalo are charging, thousands of them, and they fall over the cliff. Most of them don't die, but they break their leg or legs, and the Indian women are waiting down below to cut their throats and kill them. And even if the Indian women hadn't been there, they would have died, because a buffalo with a broken leg can't move. And this was absolutely crucial. The horse then became crucial for these Indians, because they used the buffalo, they used the hides to make their dwellings, their tents, to make their blankets, to make their clothing for cold weather. And they ate the meat, both fresh, they'd cook it, or they'd dry it. And it's sort of like now you have jerky, be like buffalo jerky, and the dried buffalo meat would last many, many months, and they could use it for months for food, particularly during the winter months. So what we'll see later in the course is when the white people started moving west from, across the Appalachian, once they moved out into the Great Plains area, by then the Indians had already had the horses for well over 100 years, 150 years, and were expert on horses. And finally, the last slide is just to give you an idea of how advanced the Indian civilization and cultures were. You don't need to memorize all these trading routes, but you can see the arrows, the purple arrows are trading routes throughout the western United States. And there were similar trading routes and systems in the central United States and the eastern United States. And one thing I like particularly about this slide is you can see the area in which horses were used. If you look sort of near the middle of the map, you have that in 1630, the extent of horse use of horses. At this time, the English, there were only a few thousand English in Virginia, and they were beginning to arrive in Massachusetts. You already have them using horses. But then you look by 1675, that lighter green, a huge geographic area where the horses were being used. And then by 1710, well before U.S. independence, the white people hadn't moved near this area in general. You had widespread use of horses. Okay, and then the next lecture, we'll look at the arrival of the English, how they arrived with expecting, like the Spaniards, to find gold and silver, and what happened when they didn't. Thank you.